The evening sun dipped low over the city of Phoenix, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet streets. Miles Carter, a seasoned journalist, was driving home from work, the soft hum of his car's engine providing a soothing contrast to the hectic day behind him. The radio buzzed softly in the background, playing a news segment about the city's increasing crime rates. He wasn't paying much attention until the familiar flash of red and blue lights flickered in his rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. He'd been pulled over countless times before, but this one felt different. He slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, his pulse quickening slightly. The officer's patrol car slid into position behind him, and out stepped Officer David Grant, a man in his early 30s with a sharp, military cut and a face that seemed perpetually set in a scowl. "License and registration," Grant commanded, his voice sharp, though not unkind. Miles, though taken aback, complied without a word. His fingers fumbled slightly as he retrieved his registration from the glove compartment, but his demeanor remained calm, controlled. He handed the documents over with a nod. "You know why I pulled you over?" Officer Grant asked, leaning in closer. "I'm not sure," Miles replied, keeping his voice even. "You ran that stop sign back there," Grant said, his tone not quite as confident as before. Miles raised an eyebrow. "I thought I made the stop, but I'll admit it was close." Grant lingered by the car for a moment, his eyes scanning Miles more closely. The casual interaction was slipping into something else. Miles felt a shift in the air, the officer's gaze growing more scrutinizing, less focused on the stop and more on who Miles might be. Grant's posture seemed to change, growing a bit more defensive. "You sure you're not in a hurry?" Grant asked, his voice slightly more edged now. "Just heading home," Miles answered. His response was simple, yet the tension between them was palpable. Something wasn't right. Grant looked at the documents for a moment before taking a step back. "Step out of the car," he ordered suddenly. Miles hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Is there a specific reason you want me out of the car?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Grant's lips twitched, his hand instinctively brushing against his holster. "I told you to step out. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Miles didn't flinch. He opened the door and stepped out, standing tall as Grant eyed him from head to toe. Miles was dressed in a well-fitted suit, the kind that signaled someone who took his work seriously. His professional demeanor was at odds with the tension in the air, but he wasn't the kind to shrink under pressure. "Put your hands on the hood of the car," Grant barked. Miles complied, his movements smooth and deliberate. As he stood there, hands flat on the car, he could feel Grant's gaze on him, sharp and probing. Miles had been through situations like this before, but there was something about the way Grant was acting, aggressive, almost eager to escalate, that set his nerves on edge. "Are you searching for something specific?" Miles asked calmly, his voice steady, but carrying an underlying challenge. Grant's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, brushing against Miles as he patted him down. "Routine search," Grant muttered, though the roughness of his hands suggested more than just routine. There was a tension in the air, a silent power struggle. The officer's movements were just a little too slow, his hands lingering a bit too long, as though trying to provoke a reaction. "You're clean," Grant muttered under his breath, clearly disappointed. He stepped back, eyes still scanning Miles with distrust. Miles turned to face him. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, if you're done." But Grant wasn't done. He wasn't finished asserting his authority. "You seem pretty comfortable with this," Grant said, taking another step toward him, his voice rising. "I'm just familiar with how these things work," Miles responded, his tone cool but not unfriendly. Grant scoffed, irritation mounting. "What are you, some kind of lawyer?" Miles smiled faintly. "Not exactly." The ambiguity of his response made Grant bristle further, his frustration growing. "You think you're smarter than me, huh?" Grant said, his voice dropping to a growl. Miles met his gaze unwaveringly. "No, officer. I just believe in fairness. Something I haven't seen much of in this interaction." Grant stood frozen for a moment, the words hanging in the air. He was visibly unsettled. But before he could respond, Miles spoke again, his voice colder now. "You're profiling me," Miles said, his tone calm but sharp. "You're assuming I don't know my rights. That's the real problem here." Grant's jaw tightened. His posture had shifted from aggressive to defensive, and Miles could see the shift in his eyes. He was realizing he'd made a mistake. But instead of backing down, Grant was digging in, trying to maintain control. "You don't know who you're talking to," Grant muttered, his frustration spilling over. "I think I do," Miles said, his voice suddenly more forceful. "And I think you need to know who you're talking to." Miles reached into his coat pocket slowly, deliberately, aware of how Grant's hand twitched toward his holster. But there was no need for theatrics. He calmly pulled out a badge and flipped it open, showing it to the officer. "Miles Carter," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. "Head of Public Integrity. Phoenix Police Department." Grant froze, his face draining of color. For a long moment, he stood motionless, staring at the badge, then back at Miles, who had not even flinched during the entire exchange. "I oversee the conduct of officers like you," Miles said, his voice calm but full of quiet authority. "My job is to make sure you uphold the very laws you swore to enforce. And based on what's happened here today, you're failing." Grant's face reddened, his earlier bravado completely gone. His eyes flicked from the badge to Miles' face, searching for some hint that this was all a joke. But there was no humor in Miles' expression, just quiet professionalism. "You've been profiling me," Miles continued, his voice gaining strength. "Assuming things based on my appearance, my job, my demeanor. This interaction was never about a traffic stop. It was about your assumptions, your biases." Grant's hands were shaking slightly now, his previous aggression replaced by uncertainty. I didn't mean." "I think you did," Miles cut him off. "But that's not the point. The point is, you've abused your power, Officer Grant. And that's a problem. For you, and for everyone who interacts with you while you wear that badge." Grant swallowed hard, stepping back as though trying to escape the reality of the situation. But there was nowhere to hide. Miles took a step forward, his voice lowering, but still unwavering. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to return my documents. And you're going to think very carefully about what happens next." Grant hesitated, but then, slowly, he reached into his chest pocket, his hands trembling as he handed Miles his license and registration. Miles took them with a quiet nod, slipping them into his wallet. "Remember this, Officer Grant," Miles said, his words deliberate. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." As he climbed back into his car and started the engine, Grant stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching him leave, his confidence shattered, his future uncertain. But for Miles, this was just the beginning. The next day, the real work would start. And this time, change would come.